Hello and welcome. I'm Jack Fink, and you're watching Eye on Politics on CBS News, Dallas-Fort Worth. We begin this week with a recent warning by the FBI in Dallas to dozens of universities from across Texas. Agents told more than 100 administrators and faculty members that the Chinese government is targeting the research being conducted on their college campuses.
There are adversaries out there who are just trying to steal as much intellectual property as they can.
Days before he retired as special agent in charge of the Dallas FBI, Matthew DeSarno discussed with reporters his top concerns.
That's both criminal cyber and national security cyber, and then the efforts, the ongoing overt efforts of the Chinese Communist Party to replace the United States as the global power.
On that same day in late October, his agents at the Dallas FBI headquarters welcomed dozens of universities from across Texas. They discussed how they could protect their research, often funded by American taxpayers, from being stolen by visiting scholars who could simply transfer the work back to their own universities in China and other countries. DeSarno told reporters about a case at UNT in Denton. The university suspended hosting 15 scholars funded by the Chinese Scholarship Council in the fall of 2020 after being briefed by the FBI.
There were researchers who were required to send all of their research back to Beijing. Once it became clear to them that was the case, they made the expulsion.
UNT says its representatives attended the FBI's conference and that, quote, UNT takes seriously its responsibility to protect intellectual property and to work with authorities to prevent against cybersecurity attacks and the threat of stolen intellectual property. The case at UNT came 1 year after a highly publicized incident involving data security and intellectual property loss at MD Anderson Cancer Center in Houston, which fired 3 scientists after federal authorities expressed concerns.
We are a target.
Dr. Ted Mitchell is the chancellor of the Texas Tech University system. He addressed the conference at the Dallas FBI and tells me their system had a similar incident.
That particular individual wound up leaving the country. And that's the whole problem with this is when you have folks that are embedded in your labs, we don't know exactly what all's being lost.
While they had previously conducted background checks on visiting researchers who stayed for at least 6 months, they realized the biggest problem is the scholars from other countries who just come and go.
Historically, we've not done background checks on those folks. We are starting to do that now to make sure that if somebody's coming to our campus, even if it's for a short period of time, that we know where they're from, we know whether or not they're being financed by government agencies elsewhere.
Has state law been beefed up to address this?
The answer is no, state law hasn't been beefed up to address this.
Our full interview with Texas Tech University System Chancellor Dr. Ted Mitchell coming up a little later. Now some other headlines across Texas. Title 42 ends next week, which is already creating an impact at the southern border. According to the Texas Tribune, officials at the El Paso border sector, which includes all of New Mexico, report they've encountered more than 15,000 migrants in the past week. Title 42 is the Trump administration policy to quickly return migrants who cross the border illegally because of the COVID-19 pandemic. Governor Greg Abbott has called for the Texas Attorney General's office to investigate whether non-governmental organizations, or NGOs, are facilitating illegal border crossings. Also this week, Texas Senator John Cornyn, Republican Congressman Tony Gonzalez, and Democratic Congressman Henry Cuellar, who represent border communities, along with West Virginia Democratic Senator Joe Manchin, sent a joint letter to President Joe Biden, urging him to extend Title 42 beyond next Wednesday's deadline to expire. Republican State Representative Tony Tinderholt of Arlington is set to challenge Dade Phelan for Speaker of the House when the new legislative session begins January 10th. We spoke with Tinderholt about his efforts and priorities.
It's always tough when you don't get to where you need to be, but you know, we still have one more shot. We've got January 10th, the first day of session, where we have the formal vote on the House floor. So we're hoping that it turns out good, and we're going to see what happens that day, sir.
And why is it important for you to run for Speaker on that day?
Well, you know, like I tell everyone else, well, first of all, the reason it's that day is the first session is the day that we choose Speaker of the House. But the reason it's important, I think, is that we have 8 priorities that the Republican Party hold as important. Out of the thousands of bills, all of them are priorities, but those are 8 bills that the Republican delegates, the Republican Party want. So we need to pass those 8 priorities. And currently, while I think the speaker is a wonderful guy, I don't think that we're going to pass those priorities. And when we put an R behind our name, we're basically saying that those things are important to us. And I think it's important that when we go to Austin, take time away from our families. Taxpayers are paying for us to be in Austin to do this work. I think it's incumbent upon us to make those 8 priorities just as important as the other things that the individual members make important as priorities for themselves.
So let me ask you about those priorities. What are some of the top ones, and why don't you think they would pass if Dade Phelan remains speaker?
Well, currently what you'll see is, like I said, I think Dade's a great guy, but Dade also uses the Democrats to win the election for Speaker of the House. Out of 150 members, you need 76. And so you have to participate with the Democrats and give them wins. Wins are like removing felonies from cheating in elections like we did last time. Wins for Democrats are not passing gender modification of children, which was low-hanging fruit last time. We had wins last time, but if we weren't going to the Democrats and asking for them to participate in what our caucus choice is, I believe that we would have significantly more wins for Republicans. Got to remember, the House is held by Republicans, the Senate's held by Republicans, and we have a Republican governor.
In speaking with some conservatives, you know, after the 2021 session, there were, I mean, the Republicans I spoke with said there were victories. You had election integrity passed, constitutional carry passed, abortion, most abortions are now banned in the state because of the so-called trigger law. And so what's the rationale for replacing him if some of the Republicans I spoke with said, hey, this was a very successful session for Republicans?
I would say that when we talk about the things we've done, we have to talk about there were wins, but some of those wins were not as strong as people want to think that they were. Let's just look at what the current speaker said in the past 3 weeks. He said that freshmen coming in and current members that think that the $28 to $32 billion, $27 to $32 billion surplus that we have, the people that think that that should be used for property tax assistance for folks is not going to happen. Well, if you ask constituents across the state, that is oftentimes their number one issue. When you look at the border, we didn't do enough on border security. The current speaker is wanting to roll back protections for unborn children. So I just believe that there's opportunity for us to be more conservative and get more conservative things done with a new speaker.
One of the things that you have advocated for are only Republicans can be committee chairs. Why is that so important?
Well, let me be clear on that. There's a couple things I want to be clear on before we say that. It says that the majority party would have chairman and chairwomen. And so if the Democrats were in control, that rule would still be in effect. So the other thing that I have to be clear about is, as a speaker candidate, I can't tell you what I will or will not do by law, who I can or won't keep. But I'll tell you that last time this rule came up, that I voted for the rule. I'm confident that the rule is going to come up again on day 3 on January 12th. As a member, I'll vote for it. And I think that the number has significantly increased. Proposition 6 last March in the Republican primary, statewide, passed by 82%. They're not saying that we dislike Democrats, because many of them are very good friends of mine. I just don't believe, and I think 82% of Republican voters are saying, why would we put them in leadership positions to be chairman or chairwomen of a committee when they have the opportunity to kill and water down Republican priority legislation? And I think that it just doesn't pass the common sense test. It doesn't mean we're punishing anyone. It doesn't mean that those are not important members. But I think that our priorities are very important as well.
Texas is one of really a relative few states that still has minority party representation as far as committee chairs. Do you think that doesn't lend a sense of quote unquote bipartisanship? Is it a false sense? What's your thought about that?
I think whether a topic is partisan or bipartisan is not, the bipartisan issues that we're going to pass will pass regardless of who we have as chairman and chairwoman. The things that both of the things we think are important, which is probably 80% of the stuff out there. But when it comes down to the priorities of the party, that's where it starts getting a little messy when you start having someone from the other party in charge of the committees that hear those bills. And let me tell you, last time we had some people stand up and talk about we don't want Austin to look like Washington, D.C. Well, let me tell you, when the Democrats left last session, they left their appointed place of duty. They accepted $221 a day in per diem, and they went to Washington, D.C. They all went to Washington, D.C. to work with the very liberal progressive members in D.C. So to think that Austin isn't already a little bit or a lot like D.C., I think would be wrong for people to think that. The fact that we're one of only a handful of states should be very telling. Doesn't mean that we're not friends, that we're not working on stuff together. It means that we're pushing the priorities of our party. And when we have Democrats in chairmanships and chairwomanships, we're literally reducing the control that the voters gave us at the ballot box to push the priorities across the line.
And as far as this issue is concerned, when you mentioned the fact that the Democrats went to Washington, are there going to be other ramifications that come out of that at the start of this session coming up?
You know, I hope so. We've talked to several members that want to hold them accountable. Look, I was at the front mic trying to hold them accountable during special sessions with the speaker, with the parliamentarians, and they wouldn't have anything to do with it. Speaker had the control to be able to go out and have them detained and brought back to their place of business. We got to remember, they all accepted $221 a day to be in Austin. A felony theft is anything over $2,500. At 12 days, they've exceeded that. I don't know any that have paid that back, and it's in the thousands, probably 10,000 or more dollars per individual. I don't know what the number is, but yes, I think we have to hold them accountable at a minimum. If the Democrat chair rule does not pass, I don't think you should be able to be in a leadership position if you left your place of duty in the last two sessions. I think that's a rule that we're going to see. But I feel the same way about Republicans. If Republicans left their place of duty, I don't think they're fit to be leaders in the Texas House.
And is there support? I mean, have you spoken with other legislators? Is there Republicans? Is there support for that? I think
that there's going to be support for something. We just don't know what yet. And I think we're going to find out on January 12th, the day where I believe the rules fight's going to happen. And I would tell people to watch closely to see what happens that day. It'll be a pretty interesting day.
What are your other priorities coming into the new session?
So I'm doing some things that I think are really important. I've authored the Protect the Power Grid every single session, but I'm going to do a couple things that are kind of new. One of the two other bills is that I wanted to study the difference between fission and fusion for power. And it's interesting that we just had that bill in draft, and at the federal level, it's the first time in history that they've been able to get a net gain from that nuclear energy. So the news reports that a cup of hydrogen could power every household for 100 years with this technology. So one of the bills I want to do is to study fission versus fusion and how Texas and America can use it as a power source. The other is that about 4 years ago, we passed a resolution to work with the Israelis on desalinization of ocean water. They've done a pretty good job of it. So I want to do another one that allows Texas to study desalinization of the Gulf Coast, because I think water is going to be more precious than any oil could ever be in the next 10 years. One of the biggest fights people don't know about that we have on the House floor is not partisan. It's literally where it's the water fights that happen, where we discuss water and how it's distributed and how it's paid for and who owns it. That's one of the biggest fights on the House floor that people don't know about.
Well, what are you actually fighting over?
It's literally water in Texas. Who has control over it and how can you get access to it? If you think about some of the places that don't have access to water and have to lease it or buy it from other folks, that is one of the biggest fights that people don't know about that happen in Texas. And I just want to take that fight off the table. I think it's our job to pass legislation that's good for all Texans. And I think water and power and energy are super, super important. So you're going to see those three bills from me this session.
I did want to ask you about two other things, and you mentioned a little bit about property tax relief. But I'm wondering, because there are going to be, as there have been typically throughout the decades, constraints on how much lawmakers can spend. And there are people who are saying, if the state spends more by giving back to the taxpayer, that's okay. Where are you on this discussion?
I think it's important. I think first and foremost, we shouldn't overspend. And I think you're going to hear that from almost every legislator, including my Democrat peers, that we shouldn't overspend. But it's high on the priority list. And, Florida, I don't believe they have a property tax, and they're number 26 in the nation. And we're really toward the bottom for property taxes. I think there are ways for us to fund government. There's several different proposals out there, but I think we have to do something. And when we do it, we have to make sure it's permanent, because everything we've done has been good, but it's very short-lived. And the reason it's short-lived is that property appraisals continue to increase. So while some cities decrease the percentage that they're taking in, property values are exceedingly increasing. And so when values go up, which is good, values going up, people's taxes are increasing. So whatever we do, we have to make sure it's permanent, has to be smart. We have to think about long-term. And then we also have to think about the fact that we have to continue to fund all areas of government. So it's going to be an interesting discussion. There's going to be $27 to $32 billion that's waiting when we get there. And we have to find out how to use it. And I just want to make sure that we're smart with it. We have to remember it's not our individual money. It's the 30-ish million people out there. It's their funds, their money, and we have to be smart about it.
And lastly, as you know, Title 42 is going to be ending next week unless the Biden administration extends it. And so how concerned are you, and what should the state be doing right now that perhaps it's not, or what else can be done?
When you look at that, Title 42, a lot of people kind of understand it a little. It's the constitutional. It's literally cutting over half of the people that are crossing are getting forced back because of Title 42. Our fear is that if this goes away, that we will go from, well, let me tell you, Obama said that 1,000 people crossing a day is an emergency. And we're talking about 9,000 to 15,000 known people trying to cross. If Title 42 goes away, we literally double, at a minimum, we double the number of people that are let into the United States, into the interior of the United States. And I think we need to be careful with that. We just saw Governor Newsom in California today come out and say, we're maxed out with illegal immigrants. We can't handle anymore. That's a Democrat saying that. Well, think about the border towns. Think about these individuals that have a population of 5,000 and they got 9,000 people crossing in 2 days into their community. So we have to be smart. We also have to think about foreign nationals that are from adversarial nations that are crossing. There's a whole section of the FBI at the border that their job is to specifically track and try to capture those folks coming across. The amount of fentanyl pills were found last week that could potentially kill 5 million people. Human trafficking in the border, these children that are being trafficked. I think I saw numbers today where over 30 or 40,000 children were let into the United States and went to people that were not their biological parent. That's scary to think about human trafficking and what this border crisis is doing. So I think the short story is getting rid of Title 42 will be horrific for those young women and children, horrible for us here because of the drug crisis. It'll be great for cartels. They're going to love it, but it's going to be bad for America and bad for Texas.
State Representative Tony Tinderholt, Republican of Arlington, thank you so much for joining us. We appreciate it.
Thank you, sir.
The Dallas FBI recently had an urgent warning for universities across the Lone Star State about their research being targeted by the Chinese government. We spoke with Texas Tech University System Chancellor Dr. Ted Mitchell about the problem.
One of the things that we're constantly trying to balance is the collaborative nature of scientists in general. And you have people around the country, in fact, around the globe, that oftentimes are working in similar areas, and they are collaborative by nature. So we're working on balancing that with the work that these scientists are doing. We have, for example, scientists here that have been working on single proteins for the entirety of their career. So protecting the work they've done over the course of their careers. We're living in a world where technology has changed dramatically, where the world itself has changed dramatically. And the approach that we're taking is one where, instead of being kind of a gotcha mentality and looking for things where it's about getting law enforcement to arrest people and prosecute people, really where we're focused more on educating people and preventing things on the front end. And that is distinctly a balance, because we do want to be able to encourage collaboration and yet at the same time protect oftentimes the life work of our researchers that have put in their blood, sweat, and tears over the course of years to create their labs and their work.
And how dangerous the situation is that where, their life's work, all of their research is slipping into the wrong hands, being stolen, if you will.
Sure. Well, this is the way we were describing it the other day. We are a target. If you talk about the way the world works right now with research universities, what we all know, what you and I know as an American university today, is actually an amalgamation. If you go back and look at the standard research university worldwide now, it's actually an amalgamation of two educational processes. You have what's called the Oxbridge educational system, which came from Cambridge and Oxford, that talk about the focus on small classrooms and education and things of that nature. But the American Research University was the amalgamation of that with the German approach, which was real heavy on research. So if you look at the first American Research University, it was actually Johns Hopkins in the late 1800s that started this model that is now everywhere. So what it does is it makes American universities a rich target for people from around the world. And so in the world that we're living in, what we're trying to do is country agnostic. It doesn't, the FBI has very specific groups that they focus on, but for us, it's just trying to make sure that we're doing things to protect our scientists, protect their life's work, and while simultaneously working to make sure that we can be as collaborative as possible with everybody that we work with.
And so what are you doing to ensure that, A, people can work collaboratively, professor, from our country to others, but at the same time, making sure that their research is being protected?
Absolutely. Great question. So on the front end of it, we're making sure that we are crystal clear with everybody about what our efforts are, meaning we want all of our professors, we want all people that are going to be visiting our campuses to understand that we're going to be doing background checks that are more extensive than what we would normally do. And let me tell you where a big vulnerability is. In research labs all around the country, and this goes back to when I was doing public health research, you'll be at a meeting, a national meeting, and somebody will approach you and say, hey, are you working on this, this, or this? And we'll say, yes, we're working on that. Well, we're working on the same thing. Can we get together? So there are a lot of visiting professors that travel back and forth to universities. And where you are highly vulnerable is with a lot of these visiting professors that are coming there literally for just a week or two. Because historically, we've not done background checks on those folks. We are starting to do that now to make sure that if somebody's coming to our campus, even if it's for a short period of time, that we know where they're from, we know whether or not they're being financed by government agencies elsewhere, so that we can take the correct protective action on the front end to make sure that they're not exposed or not gaining access to things that might be sensitive, or things that could be utilized or taken elsewhere. One of the things that is happening is in some countries, they're setting up what they call shadow labs, where you'll get people coming into our labs here, taking looks at things and simultaneously sending the information back to their country and set up a lab there. Oftentimes, what we're told is that they don't even know exactly what it is they're trying to get. They just want to get everything they can, even if it's simple lab techniques that they can use to improve things in their country that would put us at a competitive disadvantage when it comes to publications, when it comes to the research itself, when it comes to competitive grants with organizations like the NIH and the like. We need to make sure that our folks can remain competitive with what they do.
Have you had any specific issues of that, what you just described at your university system?
We actually have. We've had issues where someone would be here and unfortunately, this was the old kind of catch them and prosecute them thing, where something would happen, that something was discovered that was a bit untoward in a lab, and upon investigation and audit of that area, you find out there is something going on that shouldn't be going on, and someone actually had an affiliation with the university in a foreign country that we were unaware of, and then you wind up having to go after this individual. But the approach that we've taken has been kind of like whack-a-mole. You know, you do it here and then it pops up there. And that's what we want to stop doing. We don't want our faculty members to feel that this is some clandestine thing that we're doing through cloak and dagger. We want to be very upfront with everybody that we're going to do things to prevent this from happening on the front end. So we want to be crystal clear that as folks come to visit us, we want them here, but we're going to do background checks on them to make sure that we're protecting our own faculty with the work they do.
And let me ask you, what was the result of that specific case? What ended up being lost?
What wound up, well, we don't know exactly what was lost. What wound up happening was that particular individual wound up leaving the country. And that's the whole problem with this is when you have folks that are embedded in your labs, we don't know exactly what all's being lost. And that's one of the big issues. One of the things that was discussed during this conference with the FBI was the fact that at a place like MD Anderson, where they have massive amounts of research going on, things are being just siphoned off a little bit at a time. And by the time you realize there's a problem, you're not even sure what the damage is that's been done to your research lab. And again, keep in mind, it's with a lot of this research, it's not that you're trying to stop people from collaborating with one another. What you are trying to do is to make sure that when you have somebody that is putting their life's work into an area, that somebody else somewhere else is not taking that and using for other things. Whether it's discovery science with drugs, whether it's discovery science and basic sciences like protein research and the like, these are things that if we're not careful about protecting it, there are economic ramifications for patents and other things like that. But as importantly, you're taking folks that, again, their life's work is being taken from them, oftentimes without them even knowing.
When did you start the background checks on visiting professors?
Very recently. This is something we started. What we did was the first round of this, we actually changed a lot. Every year that all of our professors have to sign a conflict of interest and conflict of time policy or statement that is part of our policy that goes through and says, I am working for Texas Tech University and I am not spending my time working for other universities elsewhere. And that was the first step in this, just to be clear with everybody where it is they're spending their time, what it is they're doing, and making sure that they've not picked up affiliations with foreign universities that may have foreign governments behind them. So that was the first step that we did. And we've done that over the course of about the past 18 months with all 5 of the universities in our system. The second step to that, which is much more recent, is then to start saying, okay, where do we have issues with this? We started doing, if you've got somebody that comes in that's going to be a faculty member for a 6-month period or for an academic year, we've already done background checks on those folks. But where we found the vulnerability, not just here, but one of the things the FBI discusses is it's really not those individuals that are your biggest problem. The biggest problem are these people that are just coming and going. And that is something, Jack, that we all do. We do that across the country where, again, we're at meetings and things. We bump into somebody that's interested in the research that we do. We invite them here. They invite us there. And that's where it's pretty, the policies for that have been very loosey-goosey. And that's what we're trying to tighten up right now.
And was the impetus for these new tightened policies the case that you discussed before?
That's one of the emphasis for it. And the other is, just as we've discussed this with the folks at the FBI and other agencies, when you start seeing what has happened in other institutions that it's been far more problematic, it just gives pause to what it is that we're doing. What I would prefer for us to be able to do is do this before we have issues that have occurred at other places like at MD Anderson, where by the time you have figured it out, it's not one individual or two individuals, it's dozens of people that have been coming and going that you were unaware of. So we're trying to stop it before we have issues like some of our sister institutions have had.
Just a couple of more questions, and I appreciate your time, Chancellor. You mentioned this meeting that the FBI hosted at its headquarters recently, and did you hear other horror stories from other universities, and what role did you play in that meeting?
Well, so I gave one of the addresses, one of the talks about it, and what I was trying to do with a lot of my the folks that are also in academics is really just kind of give a background on why it is that we're vulnerable and talk about that, why we in higher education in general are vulnerable. And a large part of that is what I've already described. Our institutions are built to be collaborative. And our institutions that don't only just educate, but also then do things to produce knowledge for the world, we're set up in a way that makes us vulnerable because we want to be collaborative and we're doing things that are designed to benefit society as a whole. So we're vulnerable. So that's part of what my presentation was. This is why we in higher education in general are vulnerable. To answer the first part of your question, you better believe there were some real horror stories about things that have happened. And I will tell you, one of the things, and this is not Ted Mitchell speaking, but one of the presentations that one of the FBI agents gave was how we've been focused since 2001 on the war on terror. And rightfully so in many ways, but our focus has been on this so intensely for the past 2 decades that what we've not been paying attention to, especially in areas like higher education, is this war on information. And so if you look over the past 20 years, that's where things have really skyrocketed as far as intellectual property theft with certain countries from around the world. And we've been, I'm going to use the word oblivious, and I'm using it, and maybe that's too strong a word, but more or less we've been oblivious to that because our focus as a nation has been on something else. But if you look at areas like something as simple as having somebody as a foreign national in your lab that's willing to do a lot of great work, and their name goes as the first author on one of the research papers. Well, when your name is the first author on a research paper, you become what's called the corresponding author most often, which means when the NIH or other funding institutions are looking to give you money, they're going to go to the corresponding author. And what has happened over the past 20 years, more and more in American universities of our first authors are actually foreign nationals that moving forward then, when the NIH is looking for funding, they're going to them, not back to those institutions for that funding. So there's been this real shift in the number of foreign nationals that are being paid by the United States government for doing research, oftentimes they're doing not just here in the United States, but they're doing in foreign countries in these shadow laboratories. And so it's this real kind of a lopsided thing that has occurred right under our nose over the past 20 years.
Last question, and that is, has state law been beefed up to address this? And if not, does it need to be?
Great question. And the answer is no, state law hasn't been beefed up to address this, but this is something that has been made, our state legislators are becoming aware that this is an issue. And so here's the balance. And I'll go right back to what I said at the very beginning. The balance is how do we protect our faculty and protect their work while still maintaining a sense of collaboration with the folks that we need to work with around the nation and around the globe to create knowledge for the world. But this is going to be a conversation coming up during this next legislative session.
Well, Ted Mitchell, Chancellor of the Texas Tech University System, we really appreciate your insight and your time on this. Thank you so much.
Thank you, Jack. Take care.
You too. That's Eye on Politics for this week. I'm Jack Fink. Thank you for joining us. We wish a happy Hanukkah for all of you who are celebrating starting Sunday evening. You're watching Eye on Politics on CBS News, Dallas-Fort Worth.